Good evening, everybody. I'm Chris Preston with Idaho 2 Fly, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's presentation. After I beat the heck out of my dog and make her shut up, I guess that's the first order of business. I apologize for that. Excuse me. I'm sorry, let me start this over again. It's never going to be perfect, I guess, you know. I apologize. I'm Chris Preston with Idaho 2 Fly. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's Fly Fishing 101. We have a great class in store. It's going to be Devin Olsen telling us about European Nymphing, which is a technique that's just marvelous. More about that in a minute. But I'd like you all to know a little bit more about Idaho 2 Fly. We're sponsoring this event. Idaho 2 Fly is a nonprofit organization that started about 8 years ago to support men with cancer. It's a volunteer organization. Typically what we do is we have retreats, Zoom meetings with facilitated discussions, and soon with COVID restrictions relenting, we hope to have in-person support groups. All of this is with the idea of helping men deal with their disease in a more productive way. Everything is free. While it's Idaho 2 Fly and fishing is a big part of our retreats, you don't have to be a fisherman. You don't have to have any fishing experience. You just have to be a man with cancer. Our facilitated discussions really help to create a sense of community and really do good things for the guys who are going. When they realize that everybody is in the same boat, men who are frequently reluctant to talk about their feelings are more willing to share and more willing to realize that not only are they affected by the cancer, but their whole family is affected by it. This sense of community that creates really enables these men to deal with their disease in a more productive way. Our volunteers are very passionate about helping men with cancer because, I'm going to kill that dog, because most of us either we have loved one with cancer, we have cancer ourselves, or all of the above. So if you know a man with cancer, please refer him to our website for either coming to one of our retreats, which next year we'll have 3 as COVID restrictions are lifted, Zoom meetings in the meantime, and in-person support groups. So tonight, we're very lucky to have Devin Olsen as our speaker. Devin is on Fly Fishing Team USA since 2006. He's one of 3 guys to win an individual medal at the World Championships. He's a great fisherman, great fly tyer, very inventive. He has a book, Tactical Fly Fishing, which I really love. And his videos are excellent. His flies like the blowtorch, Pleva perdigon, front end loader caddis are flies which frequently are on the end of my fly line. His YouTube videos are excellent. I would recommend them all to you to get advanced training. His how to land big fish on light tippets. Once you know how to do that, you're set to go fish for tarpon or any big fish. It is really great. I also really enjoyed a recent video he did on fishing in the wind. So without any further ado, and I will turn the show program over to Devin. Devin, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me, and happy to speak to the group. My father himself has had cancer a couple times, so I'm happy to help out with those who've had similar experiences anywhere I can. So let's just dive right in. As Chris said, my name is Devin Olsen. I have been a competitor for Fly Fishing Team USA for 15 years now, I guess, since 2006, like you said. And about 5 years back, I started a business while I was still a biologist called Tactical Fly Fisher, and that's now my full-time gig. So that's our site, and you can find anything pretty much that I talk about tonight here on that site. But tonight we're going to talk about European-inspired nymphing. And I get asked a lot why I want to compete, or why would I want to compete? And that's a really good question. Most of us, when we go out to the river, we kind of want a stress relief, and we want a little bit of an escape from a lot of our everyday duties. But and I still absolutely get that out of fishing, and there's lots of times where that's what I'm after as well. But there's something about competition that's really inspired me to kind of take my fishing to levels that it wouldn't have been without it over the years. And this quote from Dead Poet Society is really apropos to that. It says, "For me, sport is actually a chance for us to have other human beings push us to excel." And being able to compete both domestically and internationally has certainly pushed my own fishing abilities far beyond what I could have gained on my own without exposure to competitive techniques and to competition in general, and to other competitors. So I've been really grateful for that. Here's the World Championships that I've fished in. I fished all over Europe, and down in Tasmania was the last one in 2019. Unfortunately, as you might expect, the last year's World Championship in Finland was canceled due to COVID, and sadly, they are holding it this year in 2021, but there's still travel restrictions for U.S. citizens, so we can't go. So we're already making our plans for Spain in 2022. And there's also a bid to hold it in Colorado again in 2025. So who knows? Maybe we'll have World Championships back on U.S. soil in a few years. Okay, so let's jump into Euro nymphing. So this first clip, I've got a bunch of clips from our video Modern Nymphing in this presentation tonight. And then I'll talk about each of the clips afterward. But this first clip kind of gives you a little bit of a background on how I came to know about sort of the more current versions of European nymphing. When we first started, we were using older sort of short line, heavy fly methods. And in 2007, my teammate Lance took me for this day, and we did a little quasi experiment that you're going to hear about.
I've had the great fortune of fly fishing for over 20 years now, but it was 10 years ago when I decided to try and make Fly Fishing Team USA that my fly fishing path changed forever. At the time, I became acquainted with Lance Egan and Ryan Barnes. They were both members of Fly Fishing Team USA at the time. It was my introduction to all the different styles of European nymphing.
After a couple of years participating in the World Championships, I came to the realization that Americans were not privy to all the best techniques. We were getting beaten consistently and by large numbers. Knowing that nymph fishing produces the most fish because trout do most of their feeding subsurface, I knew I needed to focus my efforts on getting better at nymph fishing. After playing with the European style technique for several years, my excitement grew, and eventually invited a couple of friends along for a fun trip to a little creek that had a high fish count, in hopes that they could help me learn more about it.
Lance started playing around with this a lot on his own, and he called me up one day and invited me to try out a quasi-experiment with him. We went to a stream in Utah that's known for a really high density of brown trout, and brought our friend Kurt Finlayson along. And we did this sort of experiment I call the H Creek experiment. One angler would take a dry fly and fish it through a run. Then the next angler would take a dry dropper, fish it through a run. And then the next angler would take the French nymph rig and fish it through the run after those other two methods had already been employed. Inevitably, the French nymph method caught more fish than the other two methods combined, even after they'd already been fished through the run. It was this moment that opened up my eyes to just how deadly long later European nymphing methods could be.
that technique has then morphed into what we do now, where it is now my go-to technique and my most consistent way to catch fish.
That was awesome.
All right. So that gives you a little bit of a look into what we're going to talk about tonight. So let's first start with a little bit of background theory and talk about what makes European nymphing different and why it works so well in a lot of situations. So just think of this graphic as a simplified water column profile. We have the surface at the top, and then all the way down at the bottom where you have the red, that's the bottom of the river. And at the surface, when you typically look at just a laminar flow stretch of river, you've got slightly slower current near the top because it's got a little bit of friction at the surface. And then you have your fastest water in the center 2/3 of the river. So this is where the highest velocity is, and the surface currents aren't that much slower. It's a few percent, but there is a little bit of friction there. But then down at the bottom, it's drastically slower most of the time. And the larger the substrate is on the bottom, the bigger the difference is going to be. So if you have a cobblestone river or boulders, things like that, really large substrate, then it's going to slow that water a lot down near the bottom. But if you've got silt or sand or gravel stretch of river, then the difference isn't going to be quite as large, but there still will be a definite difference. And in some rivers, as I quickly stated at the beginning, I used to be a biologist, and I worked in fisheries biology for about 7 or 8 years. And we do a lot of habitat measurements across different types of streams. And we had a water velocimeter, which is basically just what it sounds like. It's a probe that you can put on a rod and slide it from the top to the bottom of the river, and it'll give you a readout of the speed of the water wherever that probe is. And the crazy part was that there was, especially if you were in a really fast run, where there's a lot of velocity in the center of the river, and then you put that probe down near the bottom, or right near at the bottom, you could see currents that were 3 to 4 times as fast in the center of the river as you do down at the substrate. So think about that then. Have that backdrop in your mind as we look at actually presenting flies in that sort of framework. So most of us probably learned to nymph. If you come from nymph fishing, or if you've done any nymph fishing, most of us probably learned with a strike indicator. And a strike indicator is just simply you can think of it as a fly fishing's bobber. In fact, most of you know there's a type of indicator out there that's even called a thingamabobber, and all it is a suspension device that does just that. It holds your flies up a certain depth off the bottom, or to a certain depth depending upon your tippet, and that indicator is kind of your mediator, I guess, in between your flies and your rod. So it's the hinge point that you're going to mend around if you're trying to get a drift, and you're going to try and make that indicator go at the speed of the surface current that it's in, and then you're hoping that you have what's called a dead drift. But the issue is, think about that indicator rig in that same framework that I just talked about with the currents from the top to the bottom. And it's sitting up there in much faster water than where your flies are at. And as such, it gets pulled downstream quite a bit faster than the current at the bottom of the river. So it doesn't matter how much mending you do, even if you're able to get that indicator to slow down to the water speed that it's in, it's still going to be making your flies go faster downstream than they would be on their own without that indicator, acting like a kite in the surface. Now, What's different about a Euro nymphing rig? With the Euro nymphing rig, we don't have an indicator. So we have what's called a sighter, and you'll see in the diagram there that orange and yellow part near the top of the slide, and that sighter is that fluorescent part is just indicator mono or nylon that's built into your leader, and we call that a sighter. So if you hear me talking about a sighter tonight, that's all I'm talking about. It's just Euro nymphing's version of the strike indicator. And typically that sighter is going to be held above the surface currents. There are certain situations where you might float it, but in general, it's going to be above the surface. And so all you have penetrating the water is thin tippet. And because of that, you don't have that indicator grabbing all that water, and you're able to slow down your drift and control your drift much better and get less drag. And that less drag results in a better drift. And most of us know that if you've got a better drift, you're more likely to catch more fish. And so when you're Euro nymphing in any sort of current, especially, it's got to be moving water, but as long as you have current there, it's usually a pretty effective method. Okay, that's sort of a really simple vertical perspective, but there's a lot more complication once you start adding things that are going on laterally across the river as well. So here's a pocket water stream. This is a creek called Rock Creek, a very original name, like all the rock creeks across the states. But this one's in North Carolina, and this is a stream that I've fished quite a few times at a tournament that I've fished back there. And if you look at it and we start breaking it down, what you'll see is there's a lot of different current seams. So you've got a current seam coming straight down the middle of the river where those big waves are at. That's the fastest water. But there's a rock just above that is slowing the water down to the side of it, and it splits that current around that rock and makes faster water on either side. And so you've got that seam of current, that tongue of current that's a little bit slower directly below that rock. And when I fished this specific spot, I caught several fish below that rock there. But you can also see several other seams of current that are being directed around based on all those other rocks. And then if you look upstream, you've got 3 eddies because you've got rocks that are actually protruding out of the water or off the bank. And whenever you have eddies like that, it gets even more complicated because not only do you have different current speeds, but you've got totally different current directions. You've got water that's going back upstream. And so if you think about trying to fish an indicator in this situation and fit your indicator and your flies in the same speed and the same direction of current, it gets really complicated really quickly. So having a Euro nymphing rig where you can hold it all off the water is a lot more effective presentation technique when you're looking at water like this. Okay, let's go into another little breakdown of the differences between indicator and Euro nymphing.
The other style of rigging, we use a strike indicator to register the strike. Strike indicators, generally speaking, are floating devices that are going to suspend our rig and also indicate strikes.
There are a lot of pros and cons of both the sighter or European nymphing versus suspension nymphing. In most of the head-to-head comparisons, European nymphing outperforms the suspension device. One of the disadvantages of having a typical suspension type strike indicator is surface disturbance on the water. When you go to make a cast and that indicator hits, it's going to make a big splat. If that lands anywhere near a fish, there's a good chance it's going to spook it. Because the sighter is nothing more than a direct piece of monofilament already built into your leader, it leaves no more impact on the water than your leader falling on the water would. In addition, as you are making your drifts and you go to mend, if you stack mend or make a mend that moves the indicator at all, that's also going to cause disturbance on the surface of the water. Lastly, if I get down here and I end up needing to set the hook, setting that hook is going to bring that indicator straight across the top of the water and yet again make a nice big disturbance. The Euro nymphing rig avoids that by having a sighter that either doesn't touch the water or is very gentle when it lifts off the water if you set the hook. Because of the versatility in depth attainment and control, the Euro rig can easily fish shallow and deep water with equal success in both and with minimal changes to your rig in between, making it far more versatile and far easier to fish in a variety of water types than a typical suspension method. European nymphing requires no mending. It simply requires a high rod that tracks the leader through the drift. Because you have a short, tight line, you're instantly able to set the hook without having to remove any slack. The lack of slack and direct connection that a European leader provides increases your strike detection vastly over a typical suspension indicator nymphing method in most water types. One of the variables where indicator nymphing can outperform European nymphing is in the radius of presentation. Because you can suspend your rig at distance and make longer casts, you can fish further away from you with the suspension nymph method. So if you're in smooth or clear water where it's tough to approach fish, an indicator can be a benefit. However, in most water types where you have disturbances to the surface of the water and you're able to approach fish, European nymphing will often outperform suspension nymphing methods.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about gear that you might want for European nymphing. You can go out there and do it with your typical, 9-foot 5-weight trout rod, but you are going to be at a disadvantage compared to if you have a rod and some equipment that is sort of purposely built for European nymphing. So first, we're looking at a lot longer rods, typically 10 to 11-foot rods, and they're rated usually between 2 and 4 weight. Typically a 10 or a 10.5-foot 3-weight. That's like the 9-foot 5-weight of European nymphing, if you want to think of it that way. And they sound like light rods, but a lot of times that 10-foot or 10.5-foot 5-weight or a 3-weight, it's basically like if you had a 9-foot 5-weight and you just extended the taper. It's not exactly like that if you were building the rod, but you still pretty much get the same power and capability of landing fish out of the lower half of the rod that you would with a shorter, stouter rod, but then you have that softer tip that loads with light flies and also cushions light tippet as well. And then that extra length provides more reach, so you can stay further away from the fish because it is a tight line method where you have your rig off the water. The longer your rod is, the easier it is to stay further away from the fish. And then that longer rod also gives you a larger casting arc, which is easier to cast those really long leaders, as we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. European nymphing rods, they need to be light in the hand and balanced with the reel to avoid fatigue. So if they're really heavy, then you're going to be flexing your forearm all day to try and keep that rod tip up, and that gets really tiresome. And then you need to be able to load that rod with light flies or even under the mass of the rod itself to protect that fine tippet. And so that's why you have soft tips. And there's lots and lots of rod options. Here's an old screenshot from our website. We have, I don't know, several dozen rods on our site still or now. So you're more than welcome to send us an email, which you'll find at the bottom of our website. And we'll talk you through any rod options that you see there on the site to get you the best one at your personal price point. So when it comes to reels, most reels are going to work just fine for Euro nymphing, but full cage reels are best. And the reason why is that you have really thin leader and really thin line, and sometimes that line can slip between the frame and the spool. A lot of the kind of higher end American machined reels avoid that because they just have tight tolerances, but less expensive reels a lot of times have that issue. So if you can get a full cage version, then you're better off. And we have several full cage reels on our site as well. And most of the time you're wanting a reel that's a little bit heavier. So you've got a long rod and you need to have a heavy enough reel that you can counterbalance that long rod. So typically that puts a reel in the 4.5 to 6.5 ounce range, depending upon the rod. And again, we can kind of give you specific recommendations based on the rod that you might be looking at. When it comes to fly lines, you're looking at micro thin fly lines for European nymphing. So if you have a typical fly line that you might have, like a weight, let's just say you have a 3-weight fly line, weight forward 3-weight that you're fishing on your 3-weight nymphing rod. If you get that line in between the guides, it sags. Or if you get that line in between your hand where you're stripping it at the cork and the first stripping guide, then it sags. And anytime it sags, you're losing contact with your leader for one thing. So you lose sensitivity and strike detection, but also it pulls the rig back towards you and will kill some of your reach. So a long time ago, there was a rule instituted in international competitions that you had to have a leader that was no longer than twice the length of your rod. So when that rule got instituted, many of us started using 000 weight fly lines because there was only one on the market at that time. And mainly that was just because it's super thin and has very little mass, so it doesn't sag. And then kind of the company, fly line manufacturers, got onto that once we started using those. They started making European nymphing specific lines. And as a result, there was another rule instituted that fly lines have to be at least 22 thousandths of an inch thick for international competitions. So that's the diameter you'll see most Euro nymphing lines at. And as long as you have one of those, then you'll have a lot less sag in your rod, but you're still going to want a really long leader, as we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's a simplified beginning leader. And this is one that if you're new to European nymphing, it's a good one to start with. But there's other options out there as you get more advanced.
My typical formula starts with a 9-foot butt section. Then I add 3 feet of transition material, usually in the form of Suffix Elite or some sort of colored monofilament that's not as bright as a cider. Then I add 18 inches of cider material, and typically for this I use Portland indicator mono. Beyond my cider, or connected to the end of my cider, I have a tippet ring. Then I typically add about 4 feet of tippet to my first fly. Use a triple surgeon's knot with the dropper coming from the piece connected to my rod. Make a 6-inch dropper tag and add about 2 feet of tippet to my second fly if I'm fishing 2. If you combine the butt section, the transition material, the cider, and the tippet, you're looking at a leader that's about 19.5 feet. That sounds like a drastically long leader to most people. But because you're not usually casting fly line out the tip of the rod, it's really not as long as you might think. One of the things you might notice about my leader formulas is that the butt section is typified by a long level section. I really prefer not having any knots in my butt section so that it doesn't catch in my guides while I'm making casts or landing fish. So that flat level butt section with no knots goes through my guides very smoothly, and I'm able to cast at distance with very light weight and still able to shoot line.
Okay, so how many nymphs should you rig? We talked about, having multiple flies on there, but you can rig 1, 2, or 3 flies, assuming you're fishing in a state that allows it. I've fished in places like in Bosnia and in Slovenia where there's a 1-fly rule, and so you can only fish 1 fly. But I've also, and it'd be the same in British Columbia, I think. And then in Montana, you can only fish 2 flies. But in a lot of other Western states, you can fish 3. So let's talk a little bit about situations when you might want to fish any number of these rigs. So if you have 1 fly, that's when you get your best strike detection. So if there's only 1 point of weight, that's 1 point of contact that you're keeping your leader tension to. And so as soon as a fish takes that, you've got a more direct connection to it, and you're more likely to see the take. If you're fishing skinny or complex water like pocket water, you typically get your best drifts because you've only got one fly in the water, and it can't fight with the other fly for different speeds of current. Because if you've got two flies in there and they happen to be spread apart a little bit, they can get in different current speeds, just like any other two things that you put under the water. So you get better drifts, and then you might also have more accurate placement, especially into those tight pockets and seams, but also under branches and bankside obstructions as well. One fly is a better rig for a lot of those situations. Now, these days, low water in the winter or just smaller rivers, any water that's under about 2 to 2.5 feet deep, I'm most likely to be fishing one fly. But I would say that probably 80% of the time, most Euro nymphers out there are fishing two flies. And there's lots of reasons for that. Obviously, you can spread more weight between them because, a lot of times your flies are your weight when you're Euro nymphing. I haven't mentioned that yet, but we're not adding split shot to the rig. We're using tungsten beads typically, and maybe some lead wire under the body. So having two flies allows you to spread weight between those two flies, and you can get down with smaller flies that way. In a river where you might find fish that are really wanting small fly options, then two flies is often the best way to get them there. And obviously you can also show the fish multiple options. So you might be able to fish an attractor fly along with an imitative fly or something like that. And then you can spread the flies out through the column in deeper water. So in a lot of deep runs or pools, especially if you're there during a hatch time, you might find fish suspending off the bottom by a foot or two. And in that situation, having two flies with another one on the dropper, a 1.5 foot or more above, a lot of times it'll definitely get you more fish because you can actually cover more of that water and show your flies to more fish. But like I said before, if you've got two flies, it is going to be less accurate, and they can fight each other in the drift if they happen to get in separate current seams or just different speeds of current. Now, three flies. Three flies will get you maximum weight for deep water, but unless you are very adept at Euro nymphing, I do not recommend fishing three flies. That's something that you should do after you've had lots and lots of practice casting two flies, because if you think you have very many tangles at all with two flies, it gets exponentially more with three flies. And then it is a lot less accurate again, so you really can only fish it in large deep runs, pools, and maybe really wide pocket water, so like pockets that are created by boulders that are half the size of a car or more. If you've got pocket water that's created by smaller boulders, then it's hard to fit all three flies in water behind those boulders. Normally when I fish three flies, it's typically it's pretty rare for trout. It's got to be a river that's much larger than a lot of the rivers I have in Utah. It's got to be a river that you can drift boat easily or larger, or it's got to be a situation where I'm fishing for steelhead, because I often end up finding them in higher flows, late winter, and in water where I'm fishing a lot thicker tippet as well, so I don't get as good a sink rate. So I might need a lot more weight to get down to where they're at. So that's usually when I've fished three flies the most often. But there again, fish one or two flies if you're new to Euro nymphing. Don't go messing with three flies until you've got a lot of experience. Okay, here's one other option for a Euro nymphing leader, and I'm just going to hurry and touch on this. I've got another separate video on our YouTube channel that's directed specifically to this, and we talk about this a lot more in the next two instructional films that we did as well, Modern Nymphing Elevated and Adaptive Fly Fishing. But there's another leader that I've been using probably for about 5 years now that's called the micro thin leader. And basically, instead of having that taper from the 20-pound test to the 12 to the cider that you saw in that last video clip, the whole thing is just cider material and a really thin cider material, so like 4X cider material. And basically what you're trying to do with this leader is have the thinnest leader possible, so you have the least amount of sag possible, so you can fish the least amount of weight possible and still get down and also fish further away from you, and you get a lot better sensitivity. So you end up getting the best drifts you possibly can on a Euro nymphing rig with a micro leader, but this is also exceptionally difficult to cast for the average angler. So it's not something that I recommend you do until you've had lots and lots of practice with thicker leader formulas. Okay, so let's talk about some casts real quick. There's a whole long section of casting in both of our first two modern nymphing videos. I'm just going to show you one or two clips tonight, and you can consult the video if you want more. Oops.
If you've come from casting a typical fly line where you have a lot of mass to create line speed, it can be a little bit difficult to transition into casting Euro nymphing rigs. The best way to learn to cast a Euro nymphing rig, especially with an up and across presentation, is what I call the oval cast. Really, if you just look at an oval on a page, that's the shape that you're going to draw with your rod tip. When you have just flies on the end that are doing most of the loading of your fly rod, it's important that you track them around the tip of the fly rod so that you don't hit it as you go forward. So I use kind of what I think of as an oval cast, where I drop the back of the cast low and then come over the top. So I drop low and then come over the top. And that will swing those flies out around your rod and help you to make sure that you don't come in contact with it, especially with a couple of tungsten beads that tend to be a little bit difficult to avoid bruising a nice, delicate graphite rod. So use that oval cast to be able to clear that cast around the rod. One of the other things that really helps with a cast is using, oh, there's a nice fish. We'll get back to that in a second.
I still don't remember what I was about to say in that segment, but my guess is I was about to say something about you needing to make a wrist-based stroke. So if you look at the cast, this is kind of what you should be looking for. When you make that cast, you should be rotating at the wrist. So if you have been harped on by all your buddies for having a wristy cast your entire life and you can't make tight loops, then you've come to the right method. Because when you're Euro nymphing, it really does help to have a wrist-based stroke. And that is how you're going to get that oval shape when you make your cast. So you really start that back cast low, as you saw there, and then rotate over the top with your wrist. And the more wrist-based you can make that cast, usually the more reliable it'll be and the more accurate, which is kind of the opposite of when you're making traditional tight-looped casts with the dry fly or something. Okay, let's now move into how to fish the method. So there's a lot of different ways to Euro nymph. We're just going to cover some of the basics of typical drifts. This is the most, you can fish directly upstream, which we're not going to talk about tonight, but if you move kind of around that 180-degree arc, the most common way to fish a Euro nymphing leader or rig is with an up and across approach, which we'll see in this clip.
The basic up and across approach is very simple. You make a quartering upstream cast, usually 5 to 20 feet above your intended lie. You allow your flies to drift and sink during that period of drift or that length of drift. Just before your intended lie, you want to attain and then maintain tension that will allow you to detect a strike through your holding lie that you're targeting. I tend to place a holding lie that I'm wanting to target either directly across and perpendicular from me or actually slightly below me. That perpendicular to slightly below area of the drift is typically the best and deadest part of your drift when fishing up and across. Okay. Cast 10 to 15 feet upstream of your target lie, strip up some slack, let it drift, get a vertical angle with that sider. If I get a vertical angle, if there's no wind blowing, I get a nice dead drift where I'm not manipulating the flies in any way other than just having some tension directly above. If you have a horizontal type angle where your leader is at this steep or actually shallow angle downstream instead of straight up and down, then you're usually leading the flies faster than the current, which doesn't give you a dead drift. So I'm trying to avoid that, trying to get a nice vertical approach here so I get a nice dead drift. And then I let it swing out below and I go straight into a hook set or a back cast, whatever you want to call it, with a nice parallel to the water hook set. That'll drive my flies low. And then I come in a circle up and over, or an oval, and over the top, help my flies avoid hitting the rod. Nobody there through the gut of the run, so I'm going to move to the top and see if there's anybody up in this faster, quick stuff at the top, shallow, but still good water. And sometimes by doing that, I also get a different angle on the water below where I've just drifted through. And sometimes that different angle changes your drift just enough that you're able to get a fish. So it's always wise to change angles. If you start from below, move up till you get sideways. There we go. And there again, I got a different angle there, moved up a little bit. My drift had gotten a little bit deeper because I'd had some more time to sink. And that different angle changed the presentation enough that this fish took. It looks like he ate the Waltz worm.
Okay, so a couple things from that clip. First, I want to sort of correct what I did at the beginning of the clip there. You might have noticed that I made a long cast and laid my sider on the water. If you're really advanced at European nymphing and you can control your sider by stripping slack without manipulating things, then you can do that and you'll get some extra sink out of it. But the average Euro nympher, when they're first starting, you're going to want to make a cast that's short enough that your sider either just barely touches or it's off the water the whole time. That's a really common early mistake that a lot of Euro nymphers make, is they have their rod too low or their cast too long and their sider ends up getting underwater. And if your sider gets underwater, it's going to grab that fast current at the top of the river and you're going to have some downstream drag, which we're trying to avoid. That's the whole point of this method. And then also, I just want to reiterate what I kind of said at the last part of this clip here. So you can't Euro nymph with cement feet. So you can't just wade out into the river and stand in one spot and expect to cover all the water in front of you. It's not like a long range indicator method where you might cover most of a run from one spot. You're going to make a step at a time, make a bunch of drifts, make another step, make a bunch of drifts, just like I did in this segment. I only maybe took 3 steps, but I didn't catch that fish at the end of the clip until I had taken those steps and had changed the angle of my drift. And that's really important to this method. You've got to be mobile and cover different water as you go. And if you do that, then you'll give fish different angles on your flies and you'll end up catching a lot more fish. Okay, so to lead or not to lead, that is the question. It's about as close to Shakespeare as we're going to get tonight. I talked about in that clip having a vertical sider angle. And much of the time, especially if you're fishing deeper water, that's probably the best angle to have in your leader. So you may, if you're looked at sources of Euro nymphing advice elsewhere, you might have heard a lot about leading your flies. And a lot of people do. They will make a cast and they'll actually use their rod tip to track or lead their flies slightly faster than the current. That's pretty counterproductive in most situations where you're wanting a truly dead drift. If you want a truly dead drift, then you want that near vertical sider angle. And the thing that most folks don't realize when they fish it that way, they're trying to induce some tension on the tippet so they have better strike detection. But the thing you've got to realize is that your tippet is already going through that faster current near the top of the river. If you have that typical fast to slow column as you go down, from the top of the river down to the bottom, just like we talked about all the way back at the beginning of this presentation. So if you have that faster current, it's already grabbing that tippet and wanting to make it move downstream faster than where your flies are at. And so that's giving you tension that's connecting you to your flies. You don't need to add more tension most of the time. You've already got it there as long as you're tracking that leader with the sighter vertical. However, that shallow sighter angle can be useful in certain situations. So it will lead your flies a little bit faster than the current or provide downstream tension. But it can be useful, like I say, in certain water types. So this is not, it's not a true dead drift, but it is good for strike detection because you will get more tension, and it's good for shallow broken water. That's where I use it the most. So if I'm in, really shallow pocket water or a shallow riffle, then this is typically where I will use this sort of configuration. So you might have your sighter angled to the water, around 45 degrees or so, instead of closer to vertical, like 90 degrees. And that's going to give you some downstream lateral force from your rod, but it'll also hold your flies up off the bottom, so you're not going to get as deep. And that's why it's a good thing to use if you're in shallow water and maybe you just want to drift through a riffle 10 or 15 times before you move up to the deep water up above, and you just come from deep water below. Well, this is a way you can fish through that riffle without needing to make a change to your rig. One last drift that is kind of another advanced type drift. I call it the inverted sighter. So you can see it's kind of the opposite of these last two. So vertical here, downstream here. Now I've actually got an upstream sighter angle. So all you do with this one is you make your typical drift, you make your upstream cast, quartering upstream, you follow the drift down with your rod tip, and then halfway through the drift, instead of continuing to move the rod downstream, you just stop it. So you stop it midway through the drift, and your flies keep going though, obviously, in that current they're in, but your sighter can't. So your sighter stays where it's at, and it starts to invert. And the interesting thing is that your flies actually swing down before they swing up. So you get deeper presentation this way, and also your flies will stall a little bit near the bottom for a half second to a second before they speed up from that drag that's catching on your leader. And so in certain situations, especially when the water is really cold and you're fishing a deep run or a deep pool in the winter, this is a really deadly way to get some extra fish. And I found a lot of times when I've made multiple dead drifts or a dead drift with kind of some motion that I add for an induced take, if those don't work, or if I've already caught fish that way and then it stops, I can often catch more with an inverted sighter drift. Okay, so let's talk about fishing down and across real quick.
After fishing through your intended holding lie, if you haven't contacted bottom or caught a fish or had any indication of a strike that you'd set the hook on, it's usually best to allow that rig to swing out and fish down below you. Anytime you have emerging nymphs or fish that are liking to chase, that down and across approach is a really good way to go. All right, in a run like this, or even in any spot that with a little bit of slower water or deeper water, if I've gone and made some dead drifts with an up and across or an over and across type presentation, a lot of times I can get another fish or two by swinging my flies or really imitating an emerging insect at the end of the drift. You can do that just at the end of a regular dead drift, but a lot of times your flies have touched bottom or caught a fish, as they should, during the drift somewhere. So to focus on that down and across, I will normally make a cast that's either not very far upstream or just perpendicular across. Let it sink for a bit and start your drift. And then as it comes down and around, you drop your rod and you let it swing. And one of the things you can do as you make that swing is add some action to it. So you can kind of jig your flies up and down, really imitate a caddis that's emerging and coming up and down as it tries to swim up, or a jerky swimming motion. Or as you come around on the swing, you can give it some little twitches with the strip. And many of those things are good when you're coming around on that swing to entice a strike, a bit of an induced take. You can even feed a little bit of line if you want to lengthen that swing. Let's go ahead and and get a little bit deeper, make that full upstream cast. And there again, I'm just going to dead drift through the center there. And as it comes around, oh, there we go. Had to take right as it was starting to come up. Missed him though. Let's try again. And you may get it on the full swing, but a lot of times it's going to be just as those flies start to come up. So that's why this is such an effective method for fishing that down and across presentation, because it's not just a wet fly swing that's only going to focus on that. It's going to give you a dead drift that will also start to rise just like that on the swing at the bottom end of the drift.
Okay, so let's talk about setting the hook, or recognizing strikes, I guess, which goes along with this. So any hesitation, any twitch, any weird angle change that you get on that sighter, that is your visual reference cue. So if it does anything out of the norm, set the hook. I always say better set than sorry, and hook sets are free, so you can use them. You might spook fish if you're setting the hook too often, but if you have a fish take and you don't set the hook, you've already spooked it anyway, so you still might as well set the hook. And over time, you'll get better at recognizing what is a take and what's not. And then when you do set the hook, set low and downstream and parallel to the water. You do this with just kind of a quick wrist flick. Basically, you're just making a back cast like you're starting the oval cast. So make it low to the water, and that'll bring the hook back into the fish's mouth. But if you miss the fish, or it wasn't a fish, it starts your back cast, and it also keeps your flies low, so that, let's say you're fishing and you've got a bunch of trees and riparian vegetation behind you. You need to keep your cast out of those trees. Then if you set that hook with the rod really low, you'll be able to avoid losing flies to the trees behind you. And let's just cover a little bit about how we land fish. And as Chris was talking about earlier, I have a separate video on this as well. It's longer with 5 specific tips. So you can find that on our Tactical Fly Fisher YouTube channel.
Once we've set the hook, we now have to focus on playing the fish. One of the misconceptions in fly fishing is that you need a rod that's very high while fighting the fish. While that will work, you apply a lot more pressure with a low rod angle. So generally, once I hook a fish, I tend to move the rod parallel to the water and get the fish moving cross current rather than trying to lift it in the column. This keeps them fighting the current rather than letting them hang in the current using their hydrodynamic profile. When fighting a fish with a long light rod, like a 10-foot 3-weight or 10.5 3-weight, you have a lot of tipper protection, a lot of absorption in the rod. The rod will give when the fish takes and allow you to maximize that pressure you can place on the fish while protecting the tippet. I find that a long light rod enables a very quick fight that ends in a netted fish. Once we've fought the fish to the point where it's lost enough energy where we can net it, it's best to slide the fish immediately upstream of you and allow the current to bring the fish to you rather than hanging a fish downstream of you and having the current pulling it away. If you simply fight the fish to your side and directly upstream of you, once they're tired enough to get them to the surface, just let the current carry them directly into your net.
Okay, so I really hope you enjoyed the presentation tonight. If you want more information, you can look at our videos. We also have another one on here. Obviously, I haven't updated this slide in a while. But the clips that you saw tonight, they came out of this first video, Modern Nymphing, European Inspired Techniques. We have a follow-up, kind of a higher level version, where if you've done some Euro nymphing and you've seen the first video, then Modern Nymphing Elevated will take you a bit further beyond the basics. And then we have another video that follows up after that called Adaptive Fly Fishing, which not only has Euro nymphing, but also a bunch of other methods. And it's made to teach you how to fish different water types. And basically, it lends video support to my book, which my book is called Tactical Fly Fishing, Lessons Learned from Competition for All Anglers. And that book is mainly looking at water types and giving you strategies for all different types of water, from pocket water to big pools and runs and bankside lies in between, all that type of stuff, as well as some trout biology and things like that that'll help you understand the river a little bit more, make better decisions on where to fish. So that is it for me. I can take some questions if people have them.
I guess they're letting you off easy tonight.
I guess. Either they are speechless because they loved it or speechless because they hated it. We'll see.
No, you did a great job. You did a great job. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Chris, and the group.
If you have any questions, it doesn't appear that we do, but thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
For those of you who are thinking about Euro nymphing, I was slow to come to the party. I was really kind of an old school guy. And then it makes me look like I'm a really good fisherman. I catch so many fish. Devin's videos are so good. I would suggest everybody watch those.
So there's one question that came in here. It says, is there a time you would use a bobber with a Euro rig? Certainly if you are using a Euro rig and you happen to come upon a large flat, a deep flat specifically, where you've got pretty even currents, just the type of water where you might want to fish an indicator to begin with, a smooth glide that's deep, or the bottom end of a run, something like that, or a deep pool, then yeah, you can fish an indicator on a Euro rig. You're better off probably fishing something that's not a bobber type rig indicator, more like a poly indicator or something like that, just because it's easier to cast. You don't have any mass in a Euro leader to help throw an indicator that has a little more weight. So you may need to play around with the type of indicator you use. But most of that water, I tend to fish dry droppers through, and I'll do that on my Euro rig. And so that's essentially the same thing, but just with a different type of indicator at that point. But if you find yourself in really heavy water where you feel like you can't get a good drift Euro nymphing and you want to have that indicator, then by all means, give it a try. See if it helps, and if it doesn't, the worst thing that happens is that you take it back off and you go back to what you were doing. So, and you can always, you can always bring a separate rod if you feel like you need to for different water as well. Okay, talk about my approach as you advance in your technique and or fishing thinner formulas. Let's see if I can see the whole rest of the question. It got cut off there. I don't see the full question, but basically, I think the question is, do I use my micro thin leader for all the different rigs that I talk about fishing with the Euro leader? And these days, yes, I do. So I will fish single and I'll fish double nymph rigs with that micro leader. I'll fish the dry dropper, and the double dry dropper is a little bit sketchy with the micro leader. You can still do it, but you have to be really careful for tangling issues. And streamers, absolutely. Micro leader with the streamers is absolutely deadly. You can, jig them with your rod tip or move them horizontally with the rod tip, kind of like if you were stripping them at that point. But you're able to get streamers down to places you can't, and keep them there. With this method, instead of trying to fish a sink tip or a sinking line and put them in water that just only stays in there for a second or two before it zips out. So yeah, with the micro leader, I'll do it all. And as you get better and you can get to thinner and thinner leaders, you can definitely fish that micro leader on all those methods. Okay, so how do you get distance when fishing this method? Every time I try it, I seem to be fishing within 10 to 15 feet of my feet. So there's a lot of follow-up questions I would have there for you, which would be like, how long is your rod? How is your arm extended? And what's the angle of your rod during your drift? And then what sort of leader? So basically, once I saw how you were fishing, based on that, then I might be able to make some recommendations. But a couple of things. Learn to make longer casts, but also to manage your slack. So you've got to, if you need to be able to fish further away, you've got to be able to make a cast where you still can make a smooth strip or a hand twist retrieve so that you can stay in contact with your rig without affecting your drift. And that's how you're going to be able to make longer casts and fish further away. Second, think about the rod you're fishing. If you're not fishing a 10-foot or longer rod, then you need to probably invest in one. And then also get lots of practice so that you can fish a thinner leader. One of the best things about having the micro thin leader that I talked about is that you have so much less sag that you can fish not just, a little bit further away. You can fish a lot further away with that micro thin leader and still get a good drift. I would say that a good part of the time, let's say I fish either for smaller waters, I fish 10-foot rods a lot, but for a lot of rivers, I fish a 10-foot 9-inch 3-weight, Thomas and Thomas contact tube that I fish a lot. And with that rod and a micro leader, I can fish 20 to 25 feet away very comfortably. And with a dry dropper rig, even further than that. And normally, if you're in that 20 to 25 foot range, as long as you're fishing water that's got either some depth or some surface disturbance, you can easily approach fish within that range without having to worry too much about it. Do I limit myself to what is used in competition? Yeah, I do personally, just because I'm still competing. So I'm always trying to hone my skills, within the realms of what I'm able to do. It doesn't really do me a lot of good to get used to something I can't use when I show up at a competition. If I'm in a situation where I know that something outside that framework is going to help catch me a fish that I can see or something, I'm going to probably, I'm going to make it happen, because at the end, I'm still a fisherman. And if I can catch a fish, then I'm going to try and do it. But most of the time, I stay within the rules, and I don't find that it limits me really either. Some of my favorite flies for different seasons and conditions. So there's an entire kind of confidence flies section at the end of that video that we've been watching. There's a bunch of them that I have that I love. I mean, let's just spitball a few that come off the top of my head. So blowtorch, light bright perdigon, quildagon, all sorts of different perdigons. A soft tackle carrot, a waltz worm in infinite variations, a sexy waltz, a regular waltz, a cream mop. Those are kind of flies that I use all the time. And I have a lot of videos on our website. If you want to see a bunch of these patterns, we have fly tying tutorials for lots of them, along with the recipes and how to buy them. But really, those flies will work year round, and some of them are a little bit more imitative, like the quildagon's more of a beta nymph, and the soft tackle carrot usually works a little bit better when you've got caddis or just kind of summertime hatches around. But most of them are applicable year round and get used all the time. I had a slide that indicated that a 10-foot 6 to 8 weight is what the slide said for steelhead. How does this system work for steelhead? It works right. If you want to look back through my Instagram from last month, I just came back from a steelhead trip, and I put up a couple of the pictures of fish that I caught there, but we caught many dozens. It works really well. And I definitely would say that if you're typically nymphing for steelhead, then you need to look into nymphing Euro style to do it. And I swing for steelhead as well, mainly just because I enjoy it. When I lived in Oregon, I did lots of space style fishing for steelhead, but if you definitely Euro nymphing ends up catching more fish in those situations for steelhead. Troy, what are some of the techniques for dealing with wind? I just put up a YouTube video specifically on this. I would tell you to go and watch that video, because it'll tell you more than what I can say in response in a minute or two. As a beginner, would I start off with a single fly rig until I started to feel proficient? It depends upon the water you're in. If you are fishing a small stream where you can get away with it, then yes, I probably would say start with the single fly. But the issue is that as a beginner, you're also going to be fishing a thicker leader to help you turn over, your rig better. And that thicker leader is going to have more sag, and with that more sag, with that additional sag, you need more weight to counteract that, and so you're probably going to need 2 flies. So I would say if you're in a medium to large size river, you're probably still going to need to fish 2 flies. But you can try, one large one with a lot of weight to begin with and see how that goes. Just to get some practice, getting drifts and maybe not even worrying about catching fish for a little bit. But if you feel like you need additional weight to get down, or your fly or flies need to get smaller to end up convincing fish, then yeah, you're probably going to need to go to 2. Which knots do I use? A triple surgeon's rig or a triple surgeon's knot for my tippet to tippet knot. Like if I'm adding the dropper tag that I talked about using a triple surgeon's knot there. And then for my flies, I use the 1620 knot to attach tippeton to the fly. All flies work well when being jigged. I don't jig my flies initially. I usually start with a dead drift, but if I make 10 or 15 dead drifts through a spot, then I'll do basically what I call a tremor drift, where I make a drift, and once my fly has gotten down a little bit, start just barely shaking the rod tip. And the rod tip might only go, this much, maybe 1 to 2 inches. But by the time that translates down the leader, your fly just does this as it goes through the drift. And when fish are being picky, a lot of times that all of a sudden sets it apart, and that movement suggests life. I mean, your flies are more or less still kind of going through the drift as they would, but you get just a tiny little bit of movement, and that can often incite, a take. Any nymphs that I do, or nymphs that I'm fishing, I'll do that way. Sometimes a big, like a 3-inch lift and then drift, 3-inch lift, drift, maybe 2 of them drift. But then obviously if I'm fishing streamers, then it's a different game. I'm actually moving the flies intentionally. So with larger jigs. All right. Well,
very good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Let me just say, as on a personal note, I use the micro thin leader as you describe it. And when you're doing dry dropper, it's so much more effective than my 9-foot 5 weight, because you're not mending, you don't have the line on the water, and you can just dissect a pool, and you can reach over fast water and work a soft pocket. The sides of it, it's remarkably more effective and much easier to use than you think. So, but again, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time tonight. And I think we've all learned a lot. So thanks very much.
Yep. Happy to be here, and have fun on the water, everybody.
No, we will. You too. Thanks. Well, folks, I hope you all enjoyed it. We hopefully we'll have one more class this year, if not 2. But the next one should be What's Bugging John, which is John Walter of Anglers Fly Shop, talking about what flies you should be thinking about using in late June and July as Southwest Idaho gets into summer. So on that note, I'll say goodnight, and thank you all for joining. We really appreciate you supporting Idaho 2 Fly and being with us tonight. So good night, folks.